Hi friends, I'm so glad you came to the blog today. It seemed like forever since I talked to you in person, so I wanted to do that. You know, it seems like forever. I have been a story junkie. I remember as a little girl that my class went to a storytelling conference on the state capitol grounds in Raleigh, North Carolina. And I sat enthralled in front of those storytellers, hanging on their every word. I love the spoken word. I love the written word. In fact, when I was a little girl, my mother made a rule about our library visits that I could only check out as many books as I could carry because I wanted to take a whole wagon load home. So I love a story, and I always have, but more and more as I speak, and even as I live, I appreciate the power of a story even more than ever before. So I wanted to talk to you about storytelling just a little bit today, and two places to look for stories and to listen for stories. And those are to look and listen to the old stories. Now, the ancient stories that are in the Bible, those are some of the best. And yet sometimes we tend to read over them just because they're so familiar and not look for the deep truths or a fresh perspective on those. I read Sheila Gregoire's blog last week, and she was talking about Esther and Mordecai. She had such a fresh new look at that story. And then just recently I did an event where I talked about Mary and Elizabeth as a mentoring story instead of a Christmas story. I had someone come up to me afterwards and say, wow, I've never thought about that story as a fulfillment of Titus 2 and an older woman teaching a younger woman. So let's look at the old stories, the ancient stories, with fresh new eyes. Secondly, I think listening to older people is a great resource for stories. I've heard it said that when a person dies, a whole library dies. And isn't that true? That each of us, with every year that passes, we collect stories, we collect wisdom and truth. And so I want to challenge you to sit down with an older person in your life this week. Ask them some questions about growing up. One of my most precious treasures is that I got this idea out of a magazine. I sat down with my grandmother. This was several years before she passed away. And I asked her questions about her childhood, about her memories, about the toys she played with, and who was her childhood best friend. I made a recording of that, and truly it is a treasure. I listen to it every once in a while. Especially, my grandmother was a very quiet person, so without asking those questions, I would have never heard those stories. So listen to the ancient stories, read the ancient stories of scriptures, and ask an older person to tell you some stories. Secondly, listen and watch the new for stories. Now, if older people are just like a library, then children are the most wonderful ways to find new stories. Just this Saturday, I was going to a speaking event, and on the way there, I was going to be speaking on joy. On the way there, I saw this little girl riding in a little cart behind her father's bicycle. And she had the purest, most beautiful expression of joy on her face. Watching that little girl just made me think, what happens to us? We were that little girl once, just filled with joy and wonder. What brings us to a place as women where we have such a hard time experiencing joy? It was a powerful picture and a powerful question to ask just by watching this little vignette, this little story that unfolded of a little girl behind her dad's bicycle. Another powerful way to find new stories is to put yourself in new situations. On Saturday, I spoke for an event coordinated by my neighbor Cynthia, who heads up the Christian Women's Job Corps here in the area. And at lunch, I sat and listened to the stories of the women who are participants in that program and who came to the conference. They were hard stories to hear. They were stories of abuse as children, of addiction as adults, of losing their children to the foster care system. But these women's stories were so incredible because that wasn't the end of their story. They had stories of how Jesus was coming into their current situation and changing their story and redeeming their story. Now, that's not the lifestyle that I have lived, and yet to be in a new situation with new people was so refreshing to me, and I picked up the power of their stories. It just reinvigorated me, and it refreshed me and renewed me. And so listen to the old stories, watch the old stories in scriptures and in our older citizens here in the community, and then also listen and watch for new stories. Watch children and put yourself in new situations with people who might not live the way you do. Then we will be filled with stories, and as story junkies, as speakers, we can take these stories to the people that we're speaking to. They're powerful, they're impactful. I'd love